don't you think part of this problem, and I'll direct this question first at Jordan, is that we now think that we are above animals. We think that we are evolved, that we are higher, superior, more intelligent. But isn't that one of our main failings, not acknowledging the fact that we are part of the animal world?
Well, I think it's very useful to inform your ideas about what constitutes human beings by looking at carefully controlled experiments on animals and observations of animals. Because, well, if you look at our morphology, our physiology, I mean, we share organs pretty much all the way down the vertebrate chain. You know, there's a lot about us that's like other creatures. Now, you know, there's important differences too. So you look across species and you try to make comparisons where that seems useful. And sometimes that can clue you into how things originated. So Dewall, for example, who primarily studied chimpanzees, has looked at the emotional basis of morality as it emerged in chimpanzees. And before that, people like Jaak Panksepp, who's a brilliant animal rat psychologist, essentially, rat researcher of rats, showed that even rats engage in fair play when you put them together in repeated play bouts. So if a big rat can dominate a little rat by the expression of power, which he can do if he's about 10% bigger, he will do that if you put them together and they play once. But if they play repeatedly, if the big rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, at least, the little rat will stop playing. And the proclivity for reciprocity has been well documented in many mammalian species. And so we can see that our behavioral patterns have roots that are very deep, and that's useful. It helps clarify the philosophical discussion. It helps us understand ourselves better. It helps us understand that moral behavior, for example, isn't merely a consequence of rational decision-making or rational inference, let's say. It's much more deeply rooted in us than that. And so, now having said that, I would also say there are many important differences between human beings and other animals, not least our linguistic capacity and our incredible capacity for complex mimicry, which is unparalleled, I would say, and our visual ability. There's lots of things about us that are quite unique, but you know, you try to derive your wisdom where you can, and you're a fool if you ignore biology. And it's a lot easier to ignore it because it's actually difficult to study, and you have to work at it, and so it's easier, especially if you're driven by utopian social theory that implies that human beings are infinitely malleable, and you want to make them malleable in your mold of what constitutes the ideal. Well, then you can ignore biology and, you know, call people biological essentialists and other such idiocy, and we see a fair bit of that.
And Heather, what do you think? Do you think by turning our back on the animal world, thinking that, you know, that blank slatism, etc., what we've actually done is create a whole raft of problems for ourselves that didn't exist before?
We're absolutely creating a whole raft of problems for ourselves. I would add to what Jordan said another way in to point out how similar we are to many other species out there. That what Jordan's pointing out is our shared history, our shared phylogenetic history, evolutionary history, such that we can look at non-human primates and see in chimps and bonobos, who are our two closest extant relatives, many similarities, you know, ability to, you know, and yet chimps and bonobos are so different socially. You know, one of them, bonobos, tend very much towards explicit affiliation and peacemaking, and one of them, chimps, not as much, with the big caveat, as Jordan indicated before, that the alpha is actually a conciliatory figure. And you go farther back, you know, you go into other mammals, and yes, because we all share this sort of founding thing that for which we are named, mammary glands, that obligates us to maternal care, and that obligates us to sociality and relationship, and it brings in love, and therefore we get this sort of cascading series of events wherein we have closer relationships than we're at least obligated by anatomy and physiology before the evolution of milk and lactation. But I would say that that's actually not even the most interesting thing, that we can also look to birds And our most recent common ancestor with birds was some, reptile-y thing that bears no resemblance to any extant reptile now, many hundreds of millions of years ago. So birds and mammals are not all that closely related, but in some species of birds, in crows, in parrots, in a variety of lineages of birds, we also find what looks like love and long-term relationships and fair play and exchanging of ideas. So what is common? How is it that we have converged between like crows and parrots and dolphins and elephants and wolves and chimps and humans? And I'm leaving some things off that list, but that list is like, okay, social, but there's a lot more things than that are social, long-lived, generational overlap, so you can have exchange of ideas and learning between generations, and long childhoods, so that these organisms are born or hatched, depending on if they're mammals or birds, without yet fully being what they're going to be. Compare that to, any mammal, excuse me, is somewhat what we call altricial, which is to say born, not fully able yet to do everything it's going to do because it's going to need milk from its mother. But a horse, within a half an hour of being born, is able to run around and keep up with the herd-ish, because if not, it's going to get eaten. Whereas the more altricial you're born, the more helpless you're born, the more software you are. So no, we're not blank slates. And this is something that Brett and I talk about a lot, and we've actually written into the book that we have coming out in the chapters on childhood and on parenthood and relationship. We're not blank slates, but we argue, the blankest slates of any species on the planet. Like when we are born with whatever genetics we have on board, we have the most potential of any species on the planet to become anything else. Like our fate as individuals is less guaranteed at birth than even for a dolphin or an elephant or a parrot, and certainly than for a squid or a cedar or a mouse. So yeah, we aren't blank slates, but we have tremendous potential to become almost anything, and that's not at odds with the pushback that you guys, all of you and I as well, are giving to identity politics, because that I think identity politics is a failure of an understanding of emergence, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It is a reductionist approach, that the identity politics says, I am white and female and middle-aged and American and, overeducated. And okay, all of those things are true, but they don't even begin to encompass a description of me. And I could do the same thing for any of you or any other human being. And that is a reductionist, sort of metric-laden approach to an understanding of what humans are.
It's an insistence.
It's an insistence, and it's an innumeracy too. Like if you can count it, then it's real. And no, sometimes the most important things aren't countable, and sometimes the things that you can count don't matter. So let's be our whole best selves, as opposed to reducing us to the things that you can label.